OpenAI has said that they have just shut down an Iranian election meddling kind of campaign. This is so fascinating. There's a bunch of, there's a bunch to this story that goes from Microsoft that did a lot of the investigative work to how they kind of stopped it, to what the results were, to who Iran or this group was campaigning for. There's so many interesting things I want to break down for you today. Before we do that, I want to say I have just launched my very first podcasting course. Now, if you have ever wanted to start a podcast, or if you have a podcast and you want to learn ways to make it more professional and to scale and grow it, I have a podcast course that breaks down the exact steps on how I got over 4 million downloads on my podcasts and how I was able to essentially grow the audience, how I was able to do the content. I have an entire podcast studio now and a studio manager and someone that helps me with this content. How I was able to essentially build this machine, whether you want to do it the most professional way or you want to get started or do it in an amateur way. I have a podcast course that covers all of that, and especially how to grow your podcast. So there's a link in the description, podcaststudio.com/courses, where you can go learn a little bit more about this course. I would love to have you join. There's a discount for this week only, so go and check out the course. It's linked below. Now let's get to the podcast. The thing that I want to say that is really interesting is that, so there was recently a TechCrunch article that kind of, covered what's going on specifically with this entire story. But OpenAI has also published a blog post that's really interesting on this. Now, the thing that is interesting is essentially OpenAI, they banned a bunch of different ChatGPT accounts. This is kind of what they have said they're going to be doing, is like if they notice this is happening, they're going to go and ban all of the accounts related to it. Now, a lot of people have said, like, how effective is this? Are they going to be able to get around this? I actually think that there is there's some level of effective to this. So essentially, if they detect people are doing this, when it says ban accounts, sure, people are still going to be able to go to ChatGPT and say, like, write a social media post from a user about how bad Donald Trump is, write a post from a social media user about how bad Kamala Harris is, right? Like, anyone could still do that. And so technically, like, if they're trying to, like, appear like there's a whole bunch of people with a specific narrative, they could use ChatGPT, maybe free accounts or not logged in accounts or random accounts to kind of do this sort of stuff. Once they start doing it en masse, that's typically when they're actually using an API. So they have to have a specific business setup for it. They have to have a credit card on file. And as soon as that whole scenario happens, it's a lot more difficult to set the accounts up. So when they do ban an account that has like an API, there's a lot more they can do to actually stop those actors. Now, will these people just like, oh, they banned us, we're giving up? No, they'll go use Anthropic. They'll go try to make new accounts. They'll go use like all the other AI models. Like, this isn't over, but I think it's interesting because it shows what's going on, and hopefully this slows them down a bit. I'm actually more interested in the techniques they were using, who they were campaigning for, what they were saying. I think there's a lot that we can learn because they actually have what the websites were, they have screenshots, they have everything on this. So this is very interesting. If you go over to ChatGPT's blog post they just released on this, it's called Disrupting a Covert Iranian Influence Operation. I think this is kind of like a feel-good story for them to publish in a way, because this covert operation or whatever was campaigning both for and against liberals and conservatives. So it had accounts that were pro-conservative and it had accounts that were pro-liberal. And I think that this is a really smart strategy. It's not to just align with one specific political ideology, but if you're a foreign country, there's probably some things that you like from both parties, different policies that you might like from both parties. And if nothing else, their goal is to kind of stoke division in America, weaken your enemy. That's one concept. The other concept is they can essentially build a following on the right and a following on the left politically, and then they can have that same account that like traditionally always says pro-conservative things, all of a sudden maybe say something less conservative, but that country specifically likes. And same thing with liberals, always says liberal things, and then something less liberal that benefits a specific country. Now, you can imagine, is with Iran and the demographic there, a lot of the content around this actually related to Israel and Palestine and Gaza and that whole situation. So I did find that very interesting. Now, I just wanted to say this is something that ChatGPT's been talking about for a while. Back in February of 2014, February this year, February 14th, they had a blog that was called Disrupting Malicious Use of AI by State-Affiliated Threat Actors. And they talked about the fact that they were looking into this. This was something they were taking seriously, and how they were kind of going to be, what their multi-pronged approach to AI safety was going to be in this regard. So this is something they've been they have a blog post out since February, and now they have a specific operation that they're reporting on. Now, the thing I want to say about this whole operation before we get into it and what they did and what they found was that this was something that they actually, they identified the cluster of ChatGPT accounts. They were making all of this content. Apparently was something called Storm 2035. But this was actually something that Microsoft discovered a week ago and reported on, and had like a whole report. And then OpenAI, I think, went and internally looked at, if any of the content that was being generated around that was from their platform, and they found it was. So they took steps. We'll talk about their steps, but I want to talk about this Storm 2035 really quick. What's really interesting here, Microsoft published a whole thing on August 9th on this, but they said, quote, foreign malign influence concerning the 2024 U.S. election started off slowly, but has steadily picked up the pace over the last 6 months, due initially to Russian operations, but more recently from Iranian activity. This third election report from the Microsoft Threat Analysis Center provides an update on, what we've observed from Russia, Iran, and China since our second report in April of 2024. Okay, so they've done a number of reports. They talked about, how Iran was kind of entering the fold with cyber influence operations starting in June. I think this is interesting. They said past Iranian election influence efforts, and they've talked about in Israel, apparently they've kind of done some things. In Turkey, they've done some things, and then also in the United States last year, apparently they had some interesting things where I think in the U.S. specifically last year, they did SMS and email, traditional media impersonation, and some doxing and some content amplification. So that was interesting. It seems like they're getting a little bit more sophisticated this year. So what I did think was interesting, though, is kind of looking over what they were posting about. There's an Iran-run covert news site targeting U.S. voter groups, which has 4 websites that it says are masquerading as news outlets, engaging U.S. voter groups on opposing ends of the political spectrum with polarizing messages on issues such as U.S. presidential candidates, LGBTQ rights, and the Israel-Hamas conflict. The Microsoft said this group is part of a broader campaign that has been operating since at least 2020 and includes over a dozen covert news sites targeting French, Spanish, Arabic, English-speaking audiences with social and political content. This is interesting. My one comment on this, and I know that this is like a real thing that foreign actors are trying to influence in elections and like content, whatever. But I also kind of wonder what the big difference between this is versus like state-run media. So in China, we obviously have I think all the news is state-run, right? Specifically like the South China Morning Post. It's like a Chinese-based news site, but it definitely everything is kind of pro-China that would come out of that. I feel like, me being from Canada, I feel like it's kind of similar with the BBC or the CBC .ca. That's like our big news site, is the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, and I think it receives like $1 billion a year in like taxpayer funding grants from the government, and it has received a lot of that funding from the current administration, and it's very positive towards the current administration, as you can imagine. I think it'd be bankrupt. Anyways, not to get into too much politically, but I just wonder how some of these state-run, I think in Russia there's RT is the big Russia state-run kind of or influenced one. I wonder what the big difference between RT and CBC and South China Morning Post, what the big difference between those and these are. These are obviously covert random news groups, because if you just had the Iranian Times, people would be oh, I don't know if I'm gonna trust that's an unbiased source, whereas if it's the Canadian Broadcasting Group, it's okay, it definitely is gonna be biased towards Canadian things, or South China Morning Post definitely gonna be biased towards Chinese interests or whatever. So I guess maybe that's the thing, or the Russia Times obviously is gonna be biased towards Russian things, so I guess maybe that's part of it. But that's on the news front. Now, they're doing something completely different, which obviously is quite cynical on social media, the social media front, which is they have a ton of different accounts that they've created on X and I think Instagram, maybe other social media sites, where they have these fake users essentially commenting to make it seem like one narrative is more or less popular and essentially putting their opinion in. Now, this is something that is quite easy to do, right? You essentially have almost like agents, but and I think this is an important issue to think of as we get more and more closer to like real agents running completely autonomous. But you essentially have these accounts, and anytime there's a viral post about something, they could have two different people commenting on it from two different political perspectives to try to get users on those accounts from two different political sides. And then they use those accounts to push whatever their own agendas are, whatever their own messages are. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to push. I think like a lot of times because of like the last election cycle, there's, a lot of people saying, I don't know. Maybe this is controversial. People disagree with me. I feel like from the news coverage I've seen, Republicans in America are more likely to accuse liberals of siding with China, and liberals in America are more likely to accuse Republicans of siding with Russia. So I don't know if that's 100% accurate. I'm sure everyone's got, I'm sure like that. I hopefully offended everyone equally on that. But I mean, this is just like the narrative I see as a Canadian more. So I don't know, whatever. If you're mad about it, sorry. This is just like what I feel like I see more. But regardless, it's kind of interesting because all of those different groups have their own ideas and stuff. And so they're essentially, if they can grow a following in one specific political spectrum, it's not just about which political party wins, but it's about the policies. So I think the goal for them is to push the policy. They don't really care what political party is in power, right? And I'm sure all Republicans say, oh no, all of our adversaries want liberals. And I'm sure all liberals say, oh no, all Democrats say, oh no, all of our foreign adversaries want the Republicans in control. I'm sure but I mean, like, let's try to be intellectually honest and say that probably foreign actors don't care who's in charge as long as they're doing a bad job and supporting their regime or their, policies that they think benefit them, right? Like, I think that's, I'm trying to be as unbiased. That's probably pretty intellectually honest. So let's try to just be unbiased there. So it probably doesn't matter as much. And this is what we're essentially seeing from these groups, is that they try to stoke division on both sides. China is stoking division on both sides. Iran is stoking division. Russia seems to be stoking division. It doesn't necessarily matter. So as far as this Iranian threat goes, OpenAI has said in kind of relation to this that they said, quote, our investigation revealed that this operation used ChatGPT for two purposes: generating long-form articles and shorter social media comments. The first workstream produced articles on U.S. politics and global events published on 5 websites that posed as both progressive and conservative news outlets. The second workstream created short comments in English and Spanish, which were posted on social media. I think this is interesting. They're doing, they know it's isn't just like an English thing. They're like, well, there's a huge demographic of Spanish-speaking populations and other populations. They're doing every language, which I think is also very interesting. They said, we identified a dozen accounts on X and one on Instagram involved in this operation. Some of the X accounts posed as progressive and others as conservatives. They generated some of these comments by asking our models to write comments posted by other social media users, or to rewrite comments. So essentially, they would go to Twitter or they would go to Instagram, find a comment, and be like, hey, rewrite this comment. So it's like a pro-Trump comment or pro-Kamala comment, and they would just have a rewrite the comment, or negative to either one, which is interesting because, it's not like they have to come up with an elaborate prompt of like how to write the perfect political comment. They just go and rewrite other people's comments. Someone else has already doing all the work for them. They just say it in a different way, and people are, going to like it. And I also think that's a good strategy because they could go to posts and see like what the top 5 comments are with the most likes. And they're like, okay, these comments obviously get a lot of engagement. Rewrite these ones, write them as our own, try to get followers, like similar followers to our account. So they have 2 screenshots that they showed to kind of show that I think this is not a partisan. This should be a bipartisan issue. Everyone should be concerned about this. The first one was an article that this network created called "Why Kamala Harris Picked Tim Walz as her running mate: A Calculated Choice for Unity." And the second one was "X Censors Trump's Tweet: A Hidden War on Free Speech." And so one of them obviously is pro Kamala, and the other one is pro Trump and, why he got mistreated or whatever. So these appeal to totally different audiences, which I think is so interesting. They also showed 2 different social media posts. One of them said, Kamala Harris's policies are criticized for potentially leading to increased immigration costs and providing citizenship. Critics argue she might attribute these changes to climate change. It's like rolling its eyes, and then it says #dump Kamala. Okay, so this is like an anti-Kamala one. Then they had another one that was generated that says, for 248 years, Americans have been warned about someone like Donald Trump trying to crown himself king. I'm ready to fight like hell to protect our democracy. #dump Trump. Okay, that was the other one. So I think this is interesting, right? We're seeing completely different political ideologies being promoted. And then they also have like a bunch of posts, Spanish and English, that are just like about beauty content and kind of random content. So I think it's trying to just like get more followers in this regard. But regardless, I think this is interesting. They also outline a number of other areas that this group has tried to influence. So it says, quote, the operation generated content about several topics, mainly the conflict in Gaza, Israel's presence at the Olympic Games, and the U.S. presidential elections, and to a lesser extent about politics in Venezuela, the rights of Latino communities in the U.S., both in Spanish and English, and Scottish independence. They intersperse their political content with comments about fashion and beauty, possibly to feel more authentic or in attempt to build a following. So I think this is interesting. What they've essentially said in this blog post, though, is that regardless of all of the comments and stuff, none of the social media accounts that they were able to track down and link to this had a ton of engagement. Now, I think that doesn't necessarily mean that they found all of the accounts, or maybe they just found them early on. I don't know. It also doesn't mean that like they couldn't have been using Anthropic or other accounts, couldn't have been discovered that, I don't know, that do similar things. So I don't think it just means like we're totally out of the woods yet when they're just like, we tracked down the social media accounts and they don't have a ton of engagement. I don't know if that really means we're like totally clear on this. I do think this is interesting. I mean, from their perspective, sure, this is a good strategy. You go kind of stoke division in the United States, who might be your foreign adversary, or you try to build followings on both sides politically and then try to influence public policy or opinion to certain, in regards to certain conflicts. So I think this is an interesting strategy we're starting to see roll out. This is going to be something that becomes more and more this is going to be a much bigger deal in the future, as I think we have completely autonomous agents that can run some of these tasks. This is not very complicated stuff, right? You write scripts that can go to social media, grab comments, repost them, and then kind of add your own ideologies and stuff in there, tweet at people, like do all sorts of things. There's a lot going on Twitter right now where people are accusing different accounts of being AI agents or AI run. Maybe they're early versions of GPT-5 that got leaked, whatever. There's a bunch of, controversy and stuff. But I think this is definitely a topic to be aware of, as this is going to be a bigger issue in the future. So if you enjoyed the episode, if you learned anything, it would mean the world to me if you could write a review. And if you are interested in my podcasting course, where I cover exactly how to go from 0 to 100 with podcasting, or if you already have a podcast and want to take it to the next level, I talk about, from the most beginner setup I had to kind of my amateur podcasting setup to when I went and had a full-on studio with a production crew to help me produce my content. So everything I've done in all phases of this podcasting journey, and all of the marketing tips and strategies I use to organically grow to over 4 million downloads, it's covered in the course. If you're interested in starting a podcast or you've ever wanted to, it's on sale this week only. You can go check out the link in the description, podcaststudio.com/course. Hope that you all have an amazing rest of your day.